Hey, Abridgonian, welcome back. Today, we're diving deep into a story you probably never learned in history class. A story about the real spark that ignited the American Revolution. Forget what you've heard about the Stamp Act or the Boston Tea Party being the starting point. The real story, the one that truly set the stage for rebellion, began much earlier with a law called the Currency Act of 1764. This is just a dusty piece of legislation. It's the key to understanding why the colonists were pushed to the absolute brink. So, let's set the scene. Imagine the American colonies in the mid-18th century. They weren't just a collection of struggling outposts. For decades, they were flourishing. New towns were being built, farms were expanding, and trade was booming. There was a unique sense of prosperity and opportunity that was attracting people from all over the world. But what was the secret sauce? What was fueling this incredible growth? It was something deceptively simple: their own money. You see, the colonies had a big problem. They were part of the British Empire, which meant they were supposed to use British pounds, shillings, and pence. But there was never enough of it to go around. British merchants would sell goods to the colonies, take the gold and silver coins back to England, and leave the colonies in a constant state of monetary drought. How can you run a business, pay your workers, or even buy bread if there's no money circulating? It was a massive roadblock to economic development. So, the clever colonists came up with their own solution. Each colony's government started issuing its own paper money. This wasn't just flimsy paper. It was a sophisticated system known as colonial scrip. This money was a form of fiat currency, meaning its value wasn't based on being convertible into gold or silver. Instead, it was backed by the full faith and credit of the colonial government and the value of the land itself. Citizens could use this scrip to pay their taxes, and because everyone had to pay taxes, the money always had value. This system was a game changer. It allowed the colonies to finance public works, projects like roads, bridges, and schools without going into debt. It provided a stable medium of exchange, letting local economies thrive. Farmers could sell their crops, artisans could sell their wares, and workers could get paid. Benjamin Franklin, one of the sharpest minds of his era, was a huge advocate for colonial scrip. He saw firsthand how it transformed Pennsylvania from a sluggish economy into a bustling hub of activity. In his autobiography, he wrote about the immediate positive effects. Employment surged, the standard of living rose, and the general mood of the people lifted. It was, in his words, a great benefit. The colonies had essentially created their own engine of prosperity, independent of London's control. And for a while, it worked beautifully. But this success story had a dark cloud on the horizon. Back in London, powerful people were watching, and they were not happy. The main opposition came from wealthy British merchants and bankers who were creditors to the colonies. They didn't like this colonial scrip one bit. Why? Because they wanted to be paid in gold and silver, not in paper money printed thousands of miles away. They complained that the value of the scrip fluctuated, and that it was being used to pay off debts at a discounted rate, which they saw as cheating them out of their profits. These influential creditors had the ear of Parliament. They lobbied hard, painting a picture of the colonies as financially irresponsible and out of control. They argued that colonial governments were printing too much money, causing inflation and devaluing the currency. While there were isolated instances of mismanagement, the overall system was remarkably stable and effective. But the narrative in London was already set. The British elite saw the colonies' economic independence as a direct threat to their own wealth and power. They wanted to reassert control. And that brings us to the pivotal year, 1764. This is when the British Parliament passed the Currency Act. This law was a devastating blow. It wasn't a tax. It was something far more profound. The act strictly prohibited the American colonies from issuing any new colonial scrip and declared that existing scrip could not be used as legal tender to pay off debts, both public and private. Think about what that means. Overnight, the primary medium of exchange that had fueled decades of growth was outlawed. It was as if the government today suddenly declared that all the dollars in your bank account were worthless for paying your mortgage or your taxes. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The colonial economy, which had been so vibrant, ground to a halt. With their own money rendered illegal, and with no British currency to replace it, the colonies were plunged into a severe economic depression. Trade seized up. Businesses failed. Unemployment skyrocketed. Farmers couldn't sell their produce, and many lost their land because they could unpay their debts or taxes in the legally required gold and silver, which they didn't have. The prosperity that Benjamin Franklin had described just a few years earlier vanished, replaced by widespread poverty and despair. This is the context that is so often missing from our history books. Before the colonists were angry about a tax on stamps or tea, they were reeling from the complete theft of their money supply. They had built a working system from the ground up, and with the stroke of a pen, Parliament had destroyed it, not for the good of the empire, but for the benefit of a small group of wealthy British creditors. Benjamin Franklin, who was in London at the time, pleaded with Parliament. He explained the vital role of colonial scrip and warned of the dire consequences of abolishing it. He argued that the colonies had no other way to conduct commerce. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. He later wrote that this was the real, underlying cause of the revolution. The anger wasn't just about no taxation without representation. It was about economic sabotage. The colonists felt, justifiably, that Britain was willing to strangle their livelihoods for its own gain. The Currency Act made it painfully clear that their economic interests would always be secondary to those of the mother country. The prosperity they had worked so hard to build could be taken away at any moment. When the Stamp Act was passed a year later in 1765, the colonists were already at a breaking point. The economy was in shambles, people were desperate, and resentment towards Britain was at an all-time high. The Stamp Act, which required a tax to be paid in British sterling, not colonial scrip, was like pouring salt on a gaping wound. It wasn't just a new tax. It was a cruel reminder that their own money was worthless, and that they were being forced to pay for the privilege of their own economic ruin. The cry of no taxation without representation became the famous slogan, but the unspoken fury was about this deeper economic injustice. So, why isn't this story taught in every American history class? It's a complex question. Perhaps it's because focusing on taxes and political rights is a simpler, more heroic narrative. Or maybe it's because the intricacies of monetary policy are seen as too complicated. But to truly understand the American Revolution, we have to understand the Currency Act of 1764. It wasn't just a law. It was an act of economic warfare that stripped the colonies of their autonomy and plunged them into a depression. It transformed loyal British subjects into determined revolutionaries. It showed them that their future prosperity, their very ability to live and work, depended on breaking free from a system that was designed to keep them dependent and poor. The next time you think about the causes of the American Revolution, remember teas. Before the soldiers, before the tea, there was the money. The fight was not just for political freedom, but for economic survival. The Currency Act of 1764 is the forgotten key, the single most important law that set the colonies on the path to independence. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into hidden history interesting, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration. Let me know in the comments, what do you think did you learn about the Currency Act in school? See you next time.